So, welcome to Wiretap for the week of July 2nd. With me today, of course, I'm Brad. With me today, we've got Eric Portelance, digital strategist, and Jon Crowley, digital strategist. So today, we're talking about two stories in the Wire. The number one story is the story about Android buries iOS. So what that means is the ComScore report came out recently with penetration of operating systems for subscribers. And Google continues its dominance in terms of subscribers at 51%, Apple's at 32%. And RIM is shrinking rapidly, they're at like 11%. So we've got, Google and Apple, these two platforms. We're seeing Google dominating in terms of subscribers, but not necessarily in terms of usage. So what do you guys think about that?
There used to be a segment of phones called QMDs, or quick messaging devices, that were basically a step up from just a really basic, like Nokia feature phone that had full keyboards and things like that. I think as the cost of Android devices have come down quite dramatically, we're starting to see those push into the entry level where people actually may not have a data plan. And so a lot of the research I've seen on this shows that people are buying $0 Android devices on a contract with either no or very little data plan, and using it primarily as SMS and email and things like that may be packaged with it. So I think that from just an overall spread of all the Android devices out there, there's probably a lot more users that have Android that don't use it for kind of web browsing, whereas there's really going to be nobody that owns an iPhone or iOS device that has 3G connectivity that's not going to have a data plan. So I think that's part of the story. I think there may also be a part that says that people that have iOS devices are more engaged, maybe because the browsing experience is a little bit better or for whatever reason. But I think that there's kind of two parts to that.
I think there's an added layer of complexity as well, that Android devices are really preferred by most carriers. They make more of a profit on them, and they have slightly more control over what the exact specs of the device are going to be. For a lot of carriers, their big worry is getting pushed out of having some control over what the user experience is going to be, and being pushed out of SMS messaging as an example, which is a big money maker for them, and which platforms like the iPhone, for example, are pushing to the side with apps and with features like iMessage. So there's lots of reasons why people in store would be pushing you to use or purchase a new Android device instead of an iOS device, beyond the fact that there's currently 2 to 3 models of iPhone that you can get depending on where you go, and hundreds of models of Android phone you can get.
Yeah,
True, and and it boils down to cost, right?
Definitely.
I mean, if you're going to give me a smartphone for $0, I'm going to take it, right? And then I'll just use it whenever I've got Wi-Fi, like you were just mentioning.
I think what might be interesting is now Apple has kept around the old iPhone 3GS as kind of the entry level. I think $99, and I've seen it subsidized to $49 or even $0 in some cases. It'll be interesting to see the implications. Let's say this fall, the iPhone 5 or whatever they're going to call it comes out, the next generation iPhone. Whether they keep that 3GS in the market as maybe prepaid, a really cheap phone. And I almost wonder now, I guess it's over 3 years old, how cheaply can they actually manufacture that? Will that change these numbers where people will be choosing an older iPhone model over a really kind of cheap Android device, cost per dollar? So I think that'll be interesting to see how that may skew things.
Yeah, I think probably what's going to happen there is they're going to have to make a decision about whether they fork the operating system, right? Because let's face it, iOS is it bricked my old 3G essentially when it went to 4.
Yeah.
So it's eventually going to turn the 3GS into a brick as well.
Yeah,
They are starting to cut down features for older devices, however. For instance, the turn-by-turn navigation that's going to be available in iOS 6 isn't going to work on an iPhone 3GS or an iPhone 4.
Oh.
And like iOS 6, there'll be features that are limited on a first-generation iPad that you'll be able to use on the second and third-generation iPads.
Right.
So instead of forking in a traditional sense, what they're doing is continuing to update these devices, but just absolutely shutting off certain functionalities because they think they'll just make it unusably slow.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting there is that there's a lot of benefit for them to keep the platform consistent, even though they're reducing features. But the APIs are all consistent, which for developers actually I think gives a lot of confidence that even if you have a 3GS, yes, you won't be able to take advantage of all the speed and things like that, but the APIs are the same. So you can develop and target everything from a 3GS to an iPhone 5 and get a relatively consistent experience minus maybe some performance differences. Whereas what we see in Android is a much higher fragmentation, where even phones that are released today, there's no guarantee that the carriers or the phone OEMs are going to be able to push out even 2.3 or 3 or version 4 of that operating system when it comes out.
The most recent data I've seen that's actually tracked updates for Android phones over time indicates that most Android phones actually never have the most up-to-date version of Android on them. And most Android phones will have one update in terms of OS in their entire lifespan, rather than 2 or 3 that you could expect in terms of versions that will be released.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if it's a cost-based model and you're getting it for $0, you trade it in 3 years, get a new $0 phone, and off you go.
Especially because the cost of updating the OS gets pushed down to the manufacturers rather than it being handled by Google.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So, story number 2 for this week is email. So, eMarketer had a story from the Digital Marketing Association, Direct Marketing Association. It's both paper and digital. And their report had shown that email is a higher ROI than physical mailings. And email still remains the workhorse of digital marketing and relationship marketing.
Yeah.
So what do you guys see in the pharma industry, and what trends do you see out there?
No surprise on the ROI, I think. You worked in direct mail, sort of touched upon it a little bit. What's a typical conversion rate? It's like 0.
Direct mail is really interesting because the conversion rate's fairly low, but the reason it got so popular is you could actually access a reasonable amount of data in terms of who's receiving your mailings based on A, redemptions, and B, on fairly well broken down census data by area code and postal code. So being able to have that information is one of the big selling points, but the conversion rate was never anything particularly fantastic. And the thing about email is the conversion rate isn't impressive in isolation, but when you compare it to the return on impressions that you see in other online channels, it blows them out of the water. Mm-hmm. The number one thing is, like most digital outreach, email doesn't have much of a per unit cost in terms of sending out, but because people have already opted in, they've decided to receive your messages, unless you're doing something a little bit sketchy. You're going to have a much higher return because people are expecting to hear from you, and you can give them a targeted offer. The real value for email, though, is segmentation and targeting. When you have a well-developed database, you can actually ensure that people are getting offers and communications that are actually tailored to them and their interests, rather than seeing a billboard where it's one billboard for everyone who happens to walk by that corner. This is hugely beneficial for pharma when there's specific times in the patient journey when it can be helpful to get in touch with someone. If someone's giving you some information about themselves, it can be hugely beneficial to make sure to hit them at the right time with a reminder or a suggestion in terms of adherence behaviors, as an example.
Yeah, I think that as we sometimes try to pursue the shiny object a little bit too quickly and try to jump on the social media bandwagon or whatever. The questions that we get from our clients a lot, I think, are about these newer technologies, but I think we need to be careful to not forget the technologies that are still prevalent and that have demonstrated value and ROI, particularly in situations when you have a client relationship already established, where you have a CRM system in place, you've got a database of people that have raised their hand and said that we're interested in this, that you may have a lot of information about these people in terms of what messages they've opened in the past, what's resonated with them, that you can continue to build up this database and to deliver content that's more interesting and effective in the long run. So it's easy to kind of forget about that, but we all use email, and I know that there's, I receive a fair amount of newsletters and things like that. I don't look at all of them, but there are some that I read regularly because they provide a lot of value to me. And I'm happy to click through them. And so, you know, I think that as pharma companies are looking at new technologies, let's not forget that, you know, as a foundation, just having a great website and having, you know, an email marketing campaign on a regular basis that really provides content of value is still going to be a really useful source of marketing, especially when you're talking about maybe a more elderly demographic that is not necessarily going to engage to the same level on social media or be using mobile apps or whatever it is, the kind of flavor of the day, but they are, however, on email quite predominantly.
An important point, because email to a certain extent is beginning to replace the home phone as the great equalizer of communications. As more and more people are like cutting the cord in terms of having a home phone, email is the thing that you expect everyone to have. Like, I can't remember the last time I had a conversation with someone who didn't have an email address. And so having that equalizer for communication, asking everyone for an email address when they get into a program or begin interacting with you, it gives you a place where you can always attempt to reach someone. They might not always pick up to continue the comparison, but you can at least know that they're there and leave them a message of some kind. Given the overall lack of access to people's mobile numbers and reducing numbers of people subscribing for home phone, I think email is going to become even more important in the future.
Yeah, and to your point earlier about physical mailings where you have the physical address, email programs where you've got the CRM and you make an offer for a physical, you know, a physical piece that can be delivered, that can be a very powerful tactic as well. So you can get all your behavioral information off the email interactions, and you can get your demographic information from the geographic information systems as soon as you have their address. So that can be a really good two-pronged approach.
And having a really tied together database in situations like that can be fantastic, because every interaction can, with good reason, get you a little bit more information.
Yep.
You know, if someone fills out a survey to get entered in a contest, for example, or gives you their home address or mentions something about their yearly income, it allows you to really give them something that is meaningful to them instead of just a general message, which is going to increase your click-through when you're open rate.
Great. So that's the Wiretap for this week. Thank you for listening and watching, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.